So what I want to do today is I really want to let you into, it was interesting. I was filming today with the BBC and we were filming something and it was called Little Evidence, Big Crime. So where there was a turning point in a big case where it was difficult to get evidence. And they asked me a question about something and I said, look, when I was in the police, I was given these tools to investigate. And, I refuse to tell anyone. I'm well retired, as you know, but that's really important to me that some of the secrets stay secrets. But I'm going to tell you as much as I dare about the investigation of murder and more about the investigation of serial crime. So I think we have to make straight away a differentiation between what is the definition of a serial killer here in the UK and what's the definition of a serial killer in the US and some parts of the world. So over here, a serial killer is considered someone that's killed three or more people over a period of 3 weeks. And in the United States, it's 2 people or more over a period of 2 weeks. So as a psychologist, it's very, very difficult to measure like for like. And that's what psychologists are very good at, is measuring things. So these are the objectives this evening. So how do you start and what is the role of the police? And what I would like you to do is to take your own job and look at some of the problems and some of the skills that I will tell you about this evening. Not my skills particularly, but generally speaking, in a murder investigation, and see how you apply those to your own working life. Obviously, I'm not suggesting they are serial killings, but decision making and getting it right first time is often teamwork and all those sorts of things. So how do you start? Just imagine that you're called in, you start off a murder investigation where there's a single case, and that starts to accelerate. Where do you go from there? 1 or 2 of you are just logging on this evening. You've not missed anything at all. How are they managed? How are they managed? And particularly with cold cases, I just want to tell you that the College of Policing, that are the overarching authority to way policing takes place in this country, determine how these cases are investigated. And the College of Policing is made up mainly of chief constables and maybe their deputies. So how are they managed? Real life example where I've investigated a serial killing, and there is a documentary coming up on this. I should tell you, and this may, I don't know what you think of this, but I've written to Wayne Couzens in prison. Why have I done that? Very, very simply, as was the case with Letby, as was the case with Harold Shipman, I simply want to go and interview him and ask him why he did it. Because no one knows. We can speculate, but if you look at the judgment, which you can find online about Couzens, there is no rhyme or reason why he did it. So what I'd like to do is to go and interview him. I've sent a letter with a visiting order. I don't stand out too much hope. So the evolution of murder investigation. So how's it all worked? I mean, mechanically, if you go back to 1978, I first got involved in the case of a guy called Archibald Hall. Now, Archibald Hall was a British butler. He'd got previous convictions. And what happened, he was looking after a family in Knightsbridge called Scott Elliott. And basically what happened there is that the old man, Mr. Scott Elliott, sort of gentrified area, was having an affair, and Archibald Hall found out about this. And of course, Scott Elliott had a lot of money, and he started blackmailing. Anyway, like all good blackmailers, he kept going back and back and back. And eventually Scott Elliott said, I'm not giving you any more money. So he murdered him and took him up to Scotland and buried him in a hole there. And of course, as it started coming on top for Archibald Hall and the family started suspecting, so he bumped other people off. Now, it just so happened that I was on my what would be known as work experience now with the CID as part of my development in my first 2 years. My job was to, my job was simply this, was to answer the phone during the night. And this guy, Archibald Hall, actually rang into the incident room, and I kept him on the phone for about 5 minutes, and it was just me and someone else. And what we were trying to do was to trace the call, which we did successfully. And I attempted to get him to give himself up, really not knowing what I was doing at all. But let's move on. So this is a really interesting quote here. The fact that Sutcliffe, we know Peter Sutcliffe, managed to evade capture for 5 years was not due to his intelligence, but rather to an astonishing lack of it on the part of police. Why the police never thought to put him up on a line-out for the surviving victims to identify defies comprehension. Now, if you were reading that, and I know some of you are students of psychology, you would think that's some professor of psychology. Well, it's not. It's Ian Brady, who was a British Moors murderer. And the reason why I mention this is because I'm going to let you into some trade secrets about the investigation. And really, this was a turning point. The Sutcliffe case was a paper-based investigation. So you would take a witness statement, that witness statement would be filed. If there was a car or a suspect, they'd be put on card index. And this thing, I'm not going to use any swearing or anything, but you know what my sentiment is. All this sea of paper disappeared. And of course, what happened is that Sutcliffe was shown as a suspect on a number of occasions. So let's actually run through it. And I want you to imagine that you are a detective chief inspector. Just put yourself in that place, and let's just say you're investigating a non-domestic murder, and there is a particular MO. It doesn't matter what it is. Let's say the MO is strangulation, say. And in the same area, you get another one, and you're starting to think, what happens if I get another one? So, and they're linked by MO. So you're going to be the DCI investigating that. The first thing I want to tell you, that puts you under enormous strain. It's bad enough when you've got one case, and rightly so. The way my mental framing went is when I was investigating a murder case, which is the ultimate case, my job singularly is to solve that case and put that person in front of the courts. And once I've done that, that's my job done. This is how it's marshaled. It's marshaled by some software, which when we first started off was not Windows or mouse driven. It was a flaming nightmare. And when I went on the training for this as a DI, detective inspector at Hendon at the Metropolitan Police Detective Training School, the theory of it and everything else was really cool, except the whole thing was not Windows or mouse driven. So it was a really difficult course to actually get through. So this was the name of the system that came out. It was developed by a company called Unisys, and they did, once it had a Windows and it was mouse driven, the system is fantastic because you're able to interrogate the system, and it's smart. And I suspect now with artificial intelligence, AI, it's actually throwing out suspects. I'd love to go back and have a look, but I'm well retired. So this is the sort of thing that the Holmes generates. And what I don't want to do is to bog you down in, I don't know, police speak, but I certainly want to talk to you about some things here. So this is the first thing. This is the material part of a murder investigation. They're called actions, and it's where the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, dictates what is to be done. So in every single murder case in the United Kingdom since 1888, the first action is to detail a doctor to pronounce the body dead, because until you get that, the person is not legally dead. So that's the first thing. And then, so what happens is I would have a deputy or probably a shorthand writer, and I'd be firing out all these actions. So the actions are work that I want done by detectives, analysts, the press, to try and bring the investigation to a swift conclusion. And I'll show you what those look like in a minute. The second thing is, if you want to send messages to someone, do you know what? I don't know if you're like me, someone will ring into my business and I will take a message. And unless I put that on the system straight away, you run the risk of losing it or not passing that message over. So that is critically important. So Holmes marshals all of this for you. But what's important as an SIO, if you think about this, what you need is a team of people that are going to accurately and timely put all this information onto the system, onto Holmes. So therefore, not only in my last command did I have some of the finest detectives, some of the finest analysts, great press officer, crime scene examiners, I also had some really, really good typists, you know, and I would often see them typing away, and some of my younger colleagues would go and try and disturb them with some trivia, and they'd say, well, I won't tell you what they said. So the whole idea was to get this information on quickly. So that what I could do is, at the end of the day, let's say I've issued 200 or 300 actions, the system would tell me which ones are completed and what intelligence or information it's generated. So it's a really good tool, and in some cases, a crutch for me as the SIO. Exhibits, you want to keep a list of all exhibits. Certainly, if there's been a post-mortem, you need to take a witness deposition from the Home Office pathologist and get that on, because 9 times out of 10, it's going to give the cause of death. Most of the system as well is people have got open access, but there are places on this which you can keep secret if there's any sort of confidential inquiries you want doing. Any forensic submissions, what's gone to the laboratory, I'll whip through these quickly. I used to really, really think this was critically important. I don't know about you, is that certainly now, more so than when I was in it, is house-to-house inquiries. That is to make sure that where this crime's committed is that you conduct inquiries starting from the epicenter of the murder scene or the crime scene or scenes and start moving outwards, because especially now with things like Ring and that's, you know, Ring security, that is how Wayne Couzens was caught by the exceptionally good work of an acting detective inspector who I've interviewed as part of something I've done. And I think this guy was certainly on the spectrum. That's not derogatory, because he was totally and utterly focused on his job. So any interviews that you might do with the press or with any suspects, any messages, any officers' reports. So I might put in as a detective sergeant, I think we ought to go and see Mrs. Jones or Mr. Jones or whatever, and so they can put a report in, or they might see something, they might have heard something. So all of this goes on. Personal descriptive forms. I think I've told you that in 10%, from a psychological point of view, where there was an open search on open land, in 10% of the cases, as happened in the Soham case, where those 2 young Jessica and Holly were murdered, the suspect in that case interjected himself into the search. So when you're dealing with people that are kindly volunteering, you need to find out who they are from a personal descriptive form. Any questionnaires, statements, intelligence reports, I'll whip through those quickly. All of this, and again, you need to know this, and as a true crime enthusiast, what I want to do is to give you the overall picture. All of this is disclosable to the defence. In other words, every single dot and comma that you've recorded is disclosable to the defence, and that has to be disclosed by the Crown or the prosecution. Can you imagine that? If you were to print it out in paper, it'd be reams and reams and reams. The only thing that you would not hand over to them is confidential sources. So a police informant, if there was informant, they don't get to know that, and there is good protection of the law. If you don't disclose everything and the judge or the defence finds out, it's end of your case. So therefore, you have to have senior officers disclosing all of this. And this is nothing to do with the investigation. So with a serial killer, for instance, you would need a bank of personnel that are just continually harvesting and looking at CCTV. You need a disclosure officer. You need a detective sergeant to make sure that all the information is being put onto the system. So it's a big, big job. So this is actually an action. It's a real one for you to see. I'm going to be brief with this, but again, this is adding to your education. So this would be allocated, say, to Detective Sergeant Gaskin. Information, I want you to go and see someone's rung in and said they think they heard a loud noise next to the crime scene. So that's what the SIO will put in there. They will allocate it. It will have a date, time, a stamp on it, and automatically the next number. So if the action is completed, I would put on there, I went to see Mr. Smith, and he told me that during the middle of the night, he heard someone screaming. Statement taking, yes, it goes through all of these people, and it has to. It goes through an indexer, so you would have usually a constable indexing what the receiver is, the sergeant. You have another detective sergeant. I'm in overall charge, so I'm really like the politician, if you like. And then you would have an office manager making sure they were dealing with the HR needs and demands of the staff. So any further action, Mr. Smith may say, well, Mrs. Jones was with me. So you put yes, and you then just put, if there is a further action, the action number, and just put the detail, any other details in there. All of that these days can be inputted by the officer that's allocated to. What else have I put here? Yeah, the issue. It's a tool to stimulate inquiries, often an action result in a new one. They're all analysed. The best one is when the SIO issues an action to go and arrest the suspect. So you put in an action, go and do that. And that's really when the hard work starts. So I thought I'd give you an administrative overview because, you know, we do like to look at some of the meaty bits. And, you know, I've given you a very, very interesting overview. What I'm going to do, just so I can draw breath, I'm just going to have a quick look at some of your questions here. Very, very good. But the why is the most important, interesting part. Yeah, but let me just tell you, the police are not interested in necessarily why someone was murdered. Yes, it helps with the investigative process, but it has no part in court whatsoever. They're not interested in the psychology at all. And in fact, I'm going to a lecture which I can't wait, which is being delivered by a guy called Tom Little QC, KC now, and he was the prosecuting barrister in the Wayne Couzens case, and he's going to be talking about that. So yes, the why is important, and as a psychologist, I'm interested in, but the judge will clamp down on any witnesses, expert witnesses, that start trying to explain why the person behaved in that way. Not interested, which might come as a bit of a shock to you. Most scary thing could happen if there wasn't a clear reason why someone did something, I think. Now, don't get me wrong, the psychology is very useful, particularly offender profiling, to try and stop someone dead in their tracks. So let's move on to the investigation of serial killers, and let's just say it's a cold case. These are the steps. So what is it? And I'm leading on to what some of you guys have heard, but you've certainly not heard the whole picture. Is to look at how you and why you would get a serial killing cold case, why you would resurrect that case. So the first thing is to have a cohesive approach. And in my case, where I resurrected a serial killing, which we're coming to later, the cohesive approach was to go all the way through the witness depositions and just become au fait with the case. And you've got to go through all of them. So you need to record all of that. And the cases that I dealt with weren't on homes, and it took 4 to 5 weeks to actually transpose all the paper onto homes. And I had to get authority from my bosses before I did that. Obviously, now with cold cases, with outstanding serial cases, and there's not many in this country, it's worth getting a chartered offender profiler in to come and have a look. You need to look at the availability of witnesses, because it's a very dangerous thing to start an investigation, which is maybe 50 years old, and I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. And the witnesses aren't available, because if they're not and you can't bring them to court, it's a complete and utter waste of time. You might solve it, you might solve the case, but you certainly won't bring anyone to justice. You need to locate and read all the case papers. And then what you need to do is to look at what is the appetite. Now, that's not my appetite. What is the appetite to continue with that cold case investigation? In other words, with a certain amount of energy being put in, would that case, or is it likely that it could be solved? Because don't forget, and I've had a lot to do with the Metropolitan Police recently, they are at dire breaking point. Their establishment for constables is, I think it's 30,000, and they are 9,500 raw recruit constables in arrears. So the police service are under enormous pressure at the moment. I'm not condoning some of the behaviour, that's for another time. But so what is the appetite to continue? You've got to look at, can you afford to go for it? This is a big thing with me, and I know some of you will agree, some people would disagree, that with some of these outstanding cold cases, they should be subcontracted to private or retired detectives with those skills to investigate it. Over here in the UK, just to let you know, we, including me, now I'm a retired officer, cannot access live cases or outstanding cases, whereas in the US you can. There is a lot of rhetoric around when do the police service and the Metropolitan Police in particular, when do they put a case to bed, murder case? And I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you verbatim, so you know. So if a case is resurrected, or as in the Stephen Lawrence case, which I still feel hugely embarrassed about and hang my head in shame, but that case was put to bed 2 or 3 times, and it wasn't until 2 colleagues of mine, Clive and Joe Brunt, were ordered to relook at the case, and they solved it. So putting a case to bed. So a murder is committed. As you know, and if you don't know, very sadly in this country, 2/3 of all homicides, certainly last year, were domestic abuse by males killing their female partners. 2/3, and there was 701 murders last year in England and Wales. Scotland measure in a different way. 2/3 of those guys were domestic abuse. So a murder is committed. It's normally investigated by a DCI or a detective superintendent. The worst thing I ever had is where I had 6 going at the same time. There were 4 murder cases and 2 serious sexual offences. And of course, you can't possibly, it would drive me mad. So you need a DI, a deputy for each one, but you still have got the buck stops with you as the DCI or a superintendent. If the case isn't solved after 5 to 6 weeks, there is a review officer. So I have been reviewed and I've been to review. It's not a punitive Ofsted or an inspectorate type role. It's a supportive role. So what would happen is someone would come along to me, look at all my actions, look at all the witness statements and say, Steve, have you considered this? And, you know, I don't mind saying sometimes I've missed the obvious that's staring you in the face, even with a command of 140 people that are all intent on solving this case. So, and I've been along to review cases, some fairly hefty ones with officers more senior than myself and me. So there's a review officer that comes in and they may suggest further inquiries. Again, all of this is disclosable. So if you haven't solved it within 5 to 6 weeks, as a defence tactic, I've had barristers say to me, come on, Mr. Gaskin, what sort of investigation with this? This was slapdash. After 5 to 6 weeks, you hadn't solved it. So they brought someone in to come and have a look at what you were doing. So the whole idea there is to try and demean the investigation. If the case is still not solved, then what happens? There is a case conference with an assistant chief constable in the provinces or in London or the City of London. There is a commander, one rank above a chief superintendent, and there is a conference there. And rightly so, sometimes they seem quite punitive because these two senior officers are safeguarding, or it's a safety valve to make sure you've done what you're paid to do. So they will go through the whole thing with you and make sure that every nook and cranny has been covered. If not, there could be limited inquiries, or indeed an assistant chief constable or a commander could instruct someone else to carry on that murder case. So it's then put away unless there's any further information comes to light. Okay, so that's how the mechanics work. So if you see a case that's resurrected, unless further information comes to, and there has been this safeguard, of course, the police service always keep cases open, murder cases for at least 100 years to make sure, I mean, we're all living longer, to make sure that you're not completely putting to bed a case where it could be solved. Critical points, murder cases always kept alive. The clear-up rates are variable. In other words, if there is a difference, and I'd love to investigate this, if there is a difference between the clear-up rate, in other words, the solvability of murders and serial cases in one police force, it's higher or lower in the adjoining force. And why is that? And often it boils down to human resources, physical resources, and money. So most forces have got a cold case unit, and again, to let you into a trade secret, unsurprisingly, murder investigation is very, very expensive. And of course, what you're doing is you're putting, without, I've worked with some great detectives that were good at investigating pickpocketing, some that are good at investigating burglaries, some good with victims of domestic abuse. But generally speaking, you are using seasoned, or you should use seasoned detectives, and they're paid more money, their overtime rates are higher, so therefore it's a very, very expensive process. There has been a decrease in serial killings, which makes it easier for the police service. Several factors. The increase in technology has made it more difficult for serial killers, with motives such as insurance fraud, black widows. That's not a derogatory term. If you've seen the gig that I've done on Why Women Kill, you will understand that. And I'm going to bring Why Women Kill back. It's not misogynistic. It's to show why is it that women kill less people than males by far. Stricter parole policies put fewer potential serial killers back on the streets, which is good news. And finally, there's been a decrease in the availability of high-risk targets for serial killers. Do you know, I'm in the position now where I've got great nieces, great nephews, I've got 2 grandchildren, and the manner of my nieces and nephews and my children, the manner in which they safeguard their children is far greater than I've ever seen, really, in that I used to go to school backwards and forward on a bus. My daughter would never, ever allow that. Well, they're only 3 and 1, but they would never, ever allow that. And things such as, I don't know how many of you have done this. I'll tell you what, let's have a look at this. Let's just stop for a second. What I'd like you to do is to put in the chat box, if you've ever, oh, this would be interesting. If you've ever hitchhiked, thumbed a lift, or you've picked someone up. I don't want to know who but just put in there, yes, if you've done either. You've picked someone up or you've hitchhiked. Yeah. Thank you very much for your indulgence here. Yeah. And of course, what we're getting a paradigm shift here. Some of you saying, yeah, I'll hitch a lot. Never done any of this. My suggestion is, yeah, never done any of this. And there's quite a few of you, and I've done both. I would never dream of doing that. So there's been a cultural difference, hasn't there? Let's just have a look. There was something here. So after reading, you put in there, Sarah's put after reading about Ted Bundy, I wouldn't do it now. Okay. So, yeah, things like hitchhikers, there's very few. To be honest with you, I mean, I travel quite extensively, and I can't remember the last time I saw someone hitching a lift. So there's been a change of high-risk targets for serial killers. And surveillance as well as a potential deterrent. In other words, you know, doorbell security, CCTV, and everything else that comes with that. What's the time? There are this, and please, maybe I didn't mislead anyone, I don't do that, but of course we're really, really interested in why people commit serial crime. And in case you haven't seen this, I'm going to explain this very, very briefly. I've done quite a lot of work around each one of these heads, but it's to do with 3 aspects, generally speaking. Of course, as an SIO, and particularly if you've had some psychology training, some of these aspects are useful as an investigative tool. So let's just have a look. So there's 3 reasons why people commit serial crime. Biological, let's look at that first of all. Biological. The brain is still largely a mystery to scientists. As I get on in life, I'm more interested in biological psychology than anything else. We deal mainly with social psychology. That's what we deal with, and criminal psychology, of course, forensic psychology. But there are other aspects to it. And what I'm quite interested in is looking at and reading material around criminal psychopathic behavior and the shape and size and the thinning of the brain. Really, really interesting. Yeah, really interesting. There have been some attempts to link violent behavior to brain abnormality, the lack of normal maturity. The older a person gets, the less likely they are to commit serial killings. And when I've had access to the Centre for the Investigation of Serial Killers, that is one of the things that I drew out, is looking at the mean age of serial killers. And you can see that it starts off, you know, a young age, and then it starts going up, and then it starts petering out. So that's really interesting to know. Head trauma is another perspective, physiological perspective. This guy called Pasternak's an old investigation, but he reported that every killer he had interviewed in prison had suffered head trauma as an adolescent, and that included Ted Bundy. I've mentioned this before. Females have got XX chromosomes. Males have got, sorry, what am I talking about? Females have got XX chromosomes. Male have got XY. Some males are born and they're known as super males. They have an extra chromosome and they have a propensity to commit more violent crime with people without that chromosomal abnormality. And there's the crime gene as well. There's this, someone could isolate that. The trouble is, if someone isolated a gene, you're able to cut out crime, that would send the country bankrupt, wouldn't it? Because all the police service would be sacked. So for me, the crime gene and the search for the crime gene is a bit of a sort of a Hollywood thing. You may disagree. Psychological, psychopaths and sociopaths, where it tips over. And this is the thing that absolutely fascinates me. And let me give some examples. So Freud came up with 3 aspects of personality: id, ego, and superego. So the id is that insatiable desire, I want to do that now. So take my little grandson, I take him to drama once a week, blah, blah, blah. And what I do is once he's finished, I buy him a Freddo. His mum would go mad if she knew I was buying him chocolate. But anyway, I buy him a Freddo. But this little lad, when we went in there, let's start, Dad, I want that now. And we all have that desire often. But there are 2 parts that temper that. The superego on the right-hand side here will say, it's not right to do that. So if I think to myself, well, I'm going to go and bump someone off, the superego will say, you can't do that. It's wrong to do it. And that's why we've got the criminal law, where people go over that, ignore that bit. And the ego is that sort of balance. The job of the ego or self is to balance that aggressive or pleasure-seeking drive of the id with the moral control of superego. So those are the 2 reasons why we don't commit murder: is 1, the morality of it, and secondly, the force of the criminal law. So delinquent youth cannot postpone satisfaction and often react with violence. Well, some of you know that when I retired from the Met, I went back to uni and retrained as a secondary school maths teacher. And I actually found it fascinating why you'd be in the middle of a lesson and all of a sudden there was outbursts of violence. I found that quite interesting, and they can't postpone that violence. It's an outburst, and I'm sure you've seen that with if you've got kids. Organised and disorganised behaviour. I've been invited into quite a few SIG forms of late where offender profiling, how exciting is this, has come on the national curriculum if you're doing A-level psychology. But of course, there's an expectation that psychology teachers can teach it, well, they can't. But what I've done is I've developed my store or ammunition for offender profiling, and I've really kind of brought that on. So we're going to definitely do that next year, and I'm going to get you to develop your own profiles. Frustration aggression hypothesis is huge, and that is the cause of lots of violence, is frustrating someone. I used to like doing that with supply teachers when I was at school. You could easily wind them up, couldn't you, till they became violent, started shouting and everything. So frustration aggression hypothesis in terms of committing offences, particularly those sort of violent ones that we're talking about, is big stuff. And then finally, sociologically, there's a thing called social structure theory. It's assumed that certain groups of people are prone towards delinquency and criminality because of their social status in a community of society. But there is no evidence whatsoever that a serial killer comes from a particular social class. And a number of years ago, I dealt with a male barrister that couldn't, so you're talking about a well-educated man, and he had a bust up with a girlfriend. She went with someone else, and he couldn't hack it. Again, that's a really interesting study, is how many men, after a relationship has finished, has come back and murdered their partner. That is a very interesting why. Ted Bundy grew up in a warm and loving family. So where did he learn to become a serial killer? Where did he learn it? And you're either born like it, so it's evolutionary or genetically, or you learn to do it. So research does dictate, however, if you witness violent acts, you learn a valuable lesson in how to be dominant and violent. It doesn't follow, and if you've done any form of psychology examinations, that is often a nature versus nurture exam or essay title. It's looking at, it doesn't necessarily follow if I start watching violent movies that I'm then going to go out and kill someone. But what does worry me, and only time will tell, is I'm very, very concerned by what my kids report to me about how males can very, very easily, I'll be quite blunt here, can access porn to the point that it shows males how to strangle females. That to me is a nightmare. And apparently some of the papers that I've read and some of the research my business partners have done, that really does worry me, and only time will tell whether the situation gets worse. All boils down to this: you're either born violent or you learn it, or a bit of both. A bit of both. I want to talk about this case now to finish off with. And this, I've got to say, I was a police officer for many, many years. And this was certainly the hardest case that I've dealt with. It's being serialized twice on the TV. Some of you are thinking, oh my God, he's not going to bang on about that again. But you'll see the adverts. It's waiting to come on. There's two TV programs. One's called West End Girls, and the other's called The Murder of Some Bunny Girls, which I've been looking at this case since 1998, even in retirement. If you've seen this, please bear with me because it will refresh your memory. But what I have done is I've also conducted some offender profiling around this case, and I've found out more information, which is horrible what I found out, but I'm going to tell you. Basically, what you're talking about is in 1998, the Appetite, I was running a major incident suite. And basically, mercifully, we weren't getting any trading. In other words, there was a paucity of murders. So I said to my colleagues, some of you, I said, this time next week, I want all murder cases, outstanding ones for the last 25 years on my desk. End of story. I should have said, and I missed this, as a SIO, as a senior investigating officer, when you're actually on the ground running these cases, from a leadership point of view, you have to be quite dictatorial. In other words, you will do this, you will do that. Most people comply, but what the staff want is a very, very strong leader that is going to make decisions and good decisions. If you're looking at from a Carl Jung point of view, that is known as red behavior, and there's different behaviors. You can then start becoming more collegiate and involving your staff at the end of a day where you're having a debrief. And of course, I used to, most cases that I investigate weren't solved by me. One or two of them were, but they were solved by other colleagues. So it's really, really important. And again, the investigation of murder and serial murder, you have to have a very, very strong leader. I would even suggest that that leader needs to be extrovert. When I joined the police service, I was very, very much an introvert. By the time I left the training school, I wasn't. Nothing wrong with that. If you look at one of the introverts that I've followed, Captain Industry is Richard Branson. So we're going to look at the cases, the victims, the history, police response, and I've also done some mapping and offender profiling. So you've seen this before. 4 victims, awfully sad. The 2 that I was interested in was Lynn Whedon and Liz Parapicini. I've corrected this slide. I don't know what's gone on. She was 37, not 17, and she was not a schoolgirl. I've got that wrong there. But this young woman, Lynn Whedon, she was murdered in 1975 before I even joined the police service. And it was all murders, all serious and violent crime, horrendous on the victim. But this was, you can see here, this was gratuitous, just off the A4, which leads from the West Country right the way into Hammersmith. And indeed, I think the A4 finishes at Buckingham Palace. Yeah, it does. So here, terrible thing here, just off the A4, which is interesting. It's a trunk road. So offender profiling wasn't a notion then. But then just prior to that, you then have Liz Parapicini in the same area, murdered in exactly the same way. She's on holiday. You can see from her name there. She's English. She got married to an Italian national, comes over to see mum and dad, and she's bumped off. So when I had all these paper cases on my table, I went through with my deputies and said, okay, which one of these? And I showed you what have we got an appetite to look at? Where do we think we could add some value by maybe solving the case? So I didn't even know about these other 2 until I retired. You know, I'd finished and I was yesterday's man or a dinosaur. But it's just so happened that, well, let's look at this. Eve Stratford was a bunny girl, age 22. She was murdered in March 1975. So this was the first one. She was strangled, throat was cut repeatedly, hands tied. This one was a nightmare. Poor little girl, age 7 years of age, found her mother in this particular state there. Awful. How that child's recovered is beyond me. Anyway, so I didn't even know about these 2 here because they weren't on homes. They weren't tied together. And again, some of you heard me say one of the jobs that I did was coming up with some ideas or strategies for a behavioural science unit in the police service. And one of the things is that all of the Holmes inquiries hitherto were discrete. In other words, they were like little islands investigation and they weren't joined up, no joined up writing. So that's one of the things we did is electronically, as cases were finished, they were all dumped onto the behavioural science unit. So these 2 cases came up. They are linked by DNA. The sad thing is that there is no linkage or there is no suspect on the database for this. I had a look at this, these 2 cases here. When I retired, they were looked at other people. They were then looked at, all 4 of these cases, by none other than my mate, former DCI Colin Sutton. And he was going to start a full-scale investigation into this, but because of his skill, he was taken off these 4 cases, and he was detailed to go and investigate Levi Belfield. So you can see here very briefly, this is on an A to Z map, his 2 here, and 2 the other side of London. So to me, it's always been what is the common denominator. You can see here, I have no photo of, I've got one post-mortem, which obviously I'm not going to put up here. But I don't know about you, I think these girls have got something in common. Obviously, they're very good-looking girls. That's blonde hair, very light hair, and the hairstyles with the hair down is very, very similar. This is what I've done recently, and this is what's coming on the TV programs, is what I wanted to do was this. So Elizabeth Parravicini was murdered just here. And I'll tell you what I did, guys, and I actually did this. It must have been about March or April when it was still getting dark early. And what I did is I walked the route. I came out of Osterley train station and I walked down here, and this was extremely secluded. Obviously, there was traffic. This is a arterial road into London. But this bit here, I got to say, I felt uncomfortable myself in that area. But what I did do is I then walked to Church Road, and this is where Elizabeth Parappuccini was murdered. And you'll see with the two films or the two documentaries that are coming out, is we did some filming in this area. And in fact, I had a change of clothing and we hired this church so I could do this. But what's interesting, the person that I believe is responsible, and I'm 99% sure, although there's that 1%, I could be wrong, that the person I think responsible at the time was living here. That is the first one. So you can see that's when she was murdered. Lynn Weedon, if you look at the similarity of these, even if you're not familiar with the area, you've got the Great West Road here. You've got an offshoot to the right-hand side if you're going out of London. But then look at the same map quickly here. We've got the same road, and I walked again from Osterley to School Walk, and there's a little substation here, and poor little Lynn Weedon was thrown over that. So again, you're thinking, even though she was quite slight, you can need to be fairly strong to do that. And you've got this place called College Road, where this suspect was living with his parents. In fact, I'm going to be very brief with this. This is just the investigation chronology. This was, again, another friend of mine that actually put these 4 cases together, Martin Lee. Some of you have heard him speak. Red herring, it just so happened that Patsy Morris, age 14, was murdered on Hounslow Heath. Some year later, after the 1979 case, she was a student of Felton Comprehensive School, and her boyfriend was Levi Belfield, and that case is still outstanding. Case remains unsolved. But this is the advert, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. It's called West End Girls. It's 2 60-minute documentaries on ITV. It was fronted by Marcel Theroux, brother thereof, lovely guy. 30 hours of filming I did on this. I suppose they used probably about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And likewise, some of you might have seen it. I shot Wayne Couzens' Killer in Plain Sight. Channel 5, I featured in that. And that, again, was a similar amount of time. So there's nothing glamorous in doing filming at all. What I've discovered, I know the suspect personally. In this case that I'm talking about, in the early 80s, he joined the Metropolitan Police Service. So if I'm correct, that means that he had 2 murder cases under his belt before he joined, which is horrendous. He was dismissed for indecently assaulting his reporting sergeant. Do you know, when you join, the reporting sergeant has got the whip hand to decide whether or not your appointment is confirmed. So there's no way you would do that, and he indecently reported his reporting sergeant. When you go back to those thematic maps, his reporting sergeant lived very, very close, and sometimes they would get lifts in together. But the suspect that I'm talking about lived in College Road at the time. He volunteered at local school and lived in Hounslow, extremely close to both murder scenes. And in 1982, he sexually assaulted a housewife receptionist who worked at a West End club. He was masked. It was one of the most, I can't imagine someone approaching a car masked and with a knife, and committed serious sexual offences there. In 1983, he pleads guilty. This is a former police officer, by the way, to a cluster of burglaries, serious sexual offences, and is sentenced to 5.5 years imprisonment. He was in possession of stolen police radios. Why? So he could listen to the traffic. So if he was about to commit an offence, he could listen into what was going on. And finally, he's changed his name, cannot be located. Well, I found out what he changed his name to, and I know exactly where he is. he's living in an area where there is no extradition treaty with this country. Listen to this. I discovered fairly recently that he took a party of schoolgirls to Italy when he was a serving officer. Whilst on that trip, literally 2 roads away, there was a rape and murder of a young Italian woman or girl. So I'll leave that. So what really needs to happen is if a DNA sample is taken, the 2 samples that connect both scenes are very, very powerful. I don't think I'm going to go into Levi Bellfield too much. Safe to say that Colin Sutton investigated this serial killer. I did the psychology around, and I'm just about to. He and I did this gig, a roadshow a couple of times called Manhunter and Mindhunter, and we filmed it. And I'm probably going to put those out next year. So I think most of you know about Bellfield. Sutton took a totally different approach to what I would have done. I thought he took more risks than I certainly would have done. But at the end of the day, he was convicted. And you can see the thematic map here with his 5 victims. Again, this was a feature, this trunk road leading into the A316. And talking about the investigation of serial killers, is Bellfield has pitched in recently saying he was responsible for the murder which Michael Stone has been convicted of. The thing is Levi Bellfield is a criminal psychopath off the scale, and one of the hallmarks of that is a pathological liar. He's also an extreme narcissist, anything to bring attention to himself. Changed his religion recently. He sued the prison service successfully, saying he was allowed to get married. Do you know, I never comment because I'm a psychologist, but I'm sure that if you're serving a sentence, a whole life sentence, and there's a public abhorrence around that, should you be allowed to, get married? Anyway, that's for you to answer. And thirdly, and now he's saying that he's responsible. Now, he knows that he's never getting out. So, again, it's creating more press. These are some of the really, really good books. I keep coming back to this. I've never, ever met David Wilson. I've spoken to him on the phone. But this book here, A History of British Serial Killing, I find really good. And there's some other ones here. This is being taped. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave you with this, and I hope this will whet your appetite, and then I will take any questions. So we've got an idea. We floated this idea, a few of us. We got together and had a beer, and we're going to bring forth or broadcast in February, which used to be called the True Crime Festival. It's going to be rebranded. And we've invited a number of people to come on. Some have said yes, some have said I'm too busy, but these are the sort of people that we're getting on. You know Colin Sutton, he's got a lot to talk about, and I know you all enjoy his rhetoric. This is Jackie Moulton. Jackie Moulton was a champion for females in the police. She was the advisor to Linda LaPlante. She just brought a book out. I had tremendous fun. She's told me never to reveal what we got up to socially. We weren't partners or had a relationship or something, but we used to get up to a lot of mischief. You know who this bloke is, David Swindle. He does on the road things the same as Sutton and myself. Next one we're looking at is Peter Bleksley. Peter Bleksley has got the privilege of having a loaded Metropolitan Police revolver pointed at him, and that was me that did that, and I might tell you why we did this. And finally, I'm going to marshal it. But what I want to do is and we've invited 5 other people, some barristers, some pathologists, some forensic scientists. So that's coming in February, but all the details will be ready for the 1st of December. So you can say to your partners, I want a ticket for. And you know, when I've done these things before, I've made them as cost effective as possible. You know, I've got to pay these people. So there we are. So that's it, my friends. Really, really good. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to have a look at the chat box and see what you guys have got to say. Yeah, what you got to say. Yeah, any questions? You can either take your mic off, or you can, yeah, or you can put it in the chat box. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Anne. I'll be interested. Love the one you did at the beginning of the year. Thank you very much. That's really, really good. We had it sponsored by the University of the Law. They've not for any other reason. I think their skin they withdrawn their funding, but we've got another brilliant sponsor, a brilliant sponsor. So really, what I intended to do here was to introduce, you know, technically how it's done. So next time you're watching something on the TV and there's been a serial case, then you know the bones of it, how you set about it. It's really interesting as a SIO. Just finally, my last comments are: you need to keep your cool, you need to keep your wits about you, you need to make sure you go to bed because you do need to be fresh. Because I used to buy quite a few new white shirts when I was an SIO, because when a case was running, I'd want to get in the morning, be first in, have a cup of coffee, greet my colleagues, ask them about the wife and kids or partners or what have you, but make sure that they could see, because of my dress and my stature, that we were ready there to work. Great question here, Sarah. How long does an average investigation last? Well, interestingly, there is a budget attached to how long does an investigation last. It tends to be, so if you guys came out with me or we investigated a murder case, you go along to a crime scene and there's a woman dead on the floor. The first question is, where's her partner? That's the first question. So domestic abuse tends to be, the case would actually probably last. You would have a handful of detectives there if it was easily solvable. If the husband or the partner was on the run, then you beef your staff up. But it depends. I mean, I've just told you about an investigation there that's been running since 1975. Now, that's obviously what's known as an outlier. Some have been solved very, very quickly. I've had protracted cases that have solved quickly. I've had others that I said, I only want 10 staff on that. That's enough. I'll put the staff on another case, and then it's gone on for years. The interesting thing here is, for serial killing in this country, the investigation, and bearing in mind, as a psychologist, you haven't got enough material in this case because we haven't got enough serial killings to start making meaningful conclusions. But on average, for serial killings in this case, it's 2 years. Whereas in the United States, it's 7. And I've told you guys before that I wouldn't be able to hack that. I would not have been able to serve because as a public servant, I wouldn't have been able to cope with that. And, you know, after a month is bad enough, a year, but 7 years still having to go through all that. And you can't forget, and it's like with all true crime, at the end of the day, there's some poor victim's relatives at that. If you know, did the West End girls case, are they planning to arrest after they? Yeah, Sonia, a great question. The trouble is, this person lives in a jurisdiction outside of the British Isles where there is distinctly no extradition treaty. So in 99% of cases, that country where this person is, I know he's there, will not allow him to come back to this country. But there are cases where they would allow it. So this person is 68 years of age. So they could be put on trial, and we, the CPS, could ask for the person to be extradited, but what you've got to do, you've then got to get a DNA sample from him to prove the two are the same. And you can only do that after the person's arrested. So there's some technical problems there. And I believe this guy's not stupid. He's done it on purpose. Can he put on FB? Yeah, I'll certainly do that when the shows are airing. Please just take me out of the equation. I think they're fascinating because it's not just what I've talked to you about. Colin Sutton, thinks I've got it completely wrong. And he has got a particular theory. And so has another SIO. But it's just, and again, I've looked at some cases where there's huge coincidence and the person's completely innocent. And there is a 1% chance that I've got this wrong. And when I did the filming, I took legal advice about naming the person. So Theroux said to me, what is the name of the person you suspect? And I said, I've taken legal advice because the public want to know who it is. But actually, I let it slip during one of the interviews, and they stopped the film and they've taken that off because I might be wrong. Been wrong before. Good. Well, this has been taped. I've got to say, I've been doing a number of things today, which I won't bore you with. So it's always a pleasure, an extreme pleasure, to come along and have a chat with you. So 3 things. First of all, this will be uploaded to YouTube. I'll send an email out or Facebook. Secondly, we're going to put the meat on the bones for Titans of Crime. And thirdly, certainly by early December, I will get out the schedule for next year. I'm certainly committed to do it for another year before I'm looking this time next year to retire from all paid work. But yeah, there we go. That's enough about me. Great seeing you. Look after yourselves. Look after your loved ones. And it's been great talking to you about true crime. So thank you very much. And thanks for your testimonials that have got me onto the high seas. Thank you. And good night.